This is House Planning Help, episode 35. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're looking to self-build or renovate. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create a more energy-efficient home by the time I turn 40 in August 2016. But you'll probably know all of that. Coming up in this session, we take a step back. How are we doing as a world when it comes to creating better buildings? My guest is Lloyd from TreeHugger.com. So I hope you're well. Perhaps you're just about to head off to one of the International Passive House Open Days. I know it will depend when you're listening to this, but if you're listening to this at the time it's released, then that could be you. But this is a regular event that comes around every year, and hopefully it will continue that way. So maybe it's making you aware that it is something that happens every November. No doubt they'll probably change it now that I've said that, but it's a number of days that you can go and investigate, ask questions, take a look around passive house buildings. And it's so important. I love the way how when people have created homes, they're very open to sharing all the knowledge that it's taken to create that home. So I'm going to put a link into the show notes, which will tell you where your local Passive House Open Day will be taking place. But some people have opened their homes up for 3 days in a row. So I want to take my hat off to you lots. Brilliant. You're doing a great job. It's so important. Today's episode is quite a broad episode, but I like doing these every so often. The last one we did with Dr. Brenda Boardman from the Institute of Climate Change at Oxford University, but it's just to see how we're doing. Often I want to focus on those people who are really getting out there and building better houses, providing that inspiration for the rest of us to do that. But it's equally important sometimes just to look at the bigger picture. And I think that Lloyd from TreeHugger.com, he has quite a unique position just because of some of the articles that they write there, and it's about content all around the world. So I'm hoping to tap into his brain today, and I think we'll just get straight to that. I began by asking Lloyd for some background on how he started at TreeHugger.com.
Oh, well, it's actually quite a funny story. I was actually a practicing architect, and then I became a real estate developer in Toronto, Canada, and was really frustrated with the way conventional construction was being done, that everything hadn't much changed from the 19th century, let alone the 20th. And so I became fascinated with prefabricated housing. And in about 2001, started working with a large company doing prefab in Canada. Found I spent a lot of my time sitting around, so I became a very early blogger trying to educate people about prefabrication, and found that I liked blogging better than building, was sending tips to this brand new website, TreeHugger. They said, write more, please write more. Next thing I knew, I was writing full time, and the next thing I knew, I was managing editor. That's all over 10 years.
Maybe it's worth going through what TreeHugger is for anyone that hasn't visited the website before.
TreeHugger was developed in 2004 with the intent to drive sustainability mainstream. At the time, green living was really thought of as being sort of hippie-ish and counterculture. And so Graham Hill, the founder, wanted to make it seem cool and modern and slick. So it was really a design site showing the best green design in the best way it possibly could. And it was one of the first. So it was covering everything from product design to fashion design to architectural design. Now, of course, a decade later, everything has atomized a bit so that there's a website for everything. But we're still the generalist green design, and we've branched out a little bit into more on nature, just to be a general green website as well as just green design.
I like the way that it almost seems as if you've got your finger on the pulse of what's going on. So with that in mind, would you be able to reflect on how you've seen things change over the last 10 years or your time at TreeHugger?
Well, it's funny because I also teach sustainable design at Ryerson University in Toronto, and never get to use the courses from the previous year because everything is changing so radically all the time. You know, a few years ago, as an example, if you would ask 5 years ago, what's the most important thing you could do to to be green, you would actually get an answer. I had this once: stop vampire power. All the power that is lost by the wall warts that charge our electronics. Like 5 years ago, every second article was about this on every website, as if vampire power was the biggest thing going. It's totally inconsequential. And 6 years ago, every single article on every site was almost about having a clothesline instead of a dryer, and you never see that anymore. People would get preoccupied with little things because nobody really understood what the big things were. What I think that we've really learned is that it's not about stuff. It's not about green gizmos on your roof, about covering your roofs, although this is very big still with solar panels and water heaters and things like that, and fancy technologies. It's really about not living with less, but moderation. It's about moderation in everything, so that if you simply use less of everything by driving less, by getting the smaller car, by building the smaller house, by putting in smaller windows because windows are such a major source of heat loss, by doing sensible moderation, you can make a huge difference in your carbon footprint, far more than you can by going out and buying Priuses and covering your roof with solar panels. And this message of the importance of living with less, of moderation, is, I think, beginning to get through, because we're realizing there was a fascinating study that was done that basically showed, and this was an American study, where in Britain and the UK you're far better about this, that you could build the greenest building and the greenest house in the country or in the suburbs, but if you're driving to it, the footprint of your car, of the infrastructure to support your car, of the gasoline going into that car, just dwarfs everything else. Our biggest problem is gasoline and oil and the carbon footprint from that. And if we can get people living closer to where they work, riding bikes or walking to where they work, that's going to make a much, much bigger difference than some new, high, expensive piece of technology.
I do wonder whether people hear the message, agree with it, and then don't really act. So how can we make sure that we implement this?
Well, when I talk about this, I'm really talking to more of an American audience, because in the United Kingdom, you pretty much already do go a long way towards that. People do live in smaller houses. They do tend to take the tube more and drive a little less. And they do have my big bête noire, the sort of refrigerators, the American 1.2 meter wide fridges, 4-foot wide fridges that hold.
But you say all that, and actually I think that we follow America, but just in delay sometimes.
Interesting.
So certainly we've noticed with cars that cars have started to get a bit bigger. What used to be a small car, say for example a Mini, now looks like it's on steroids.
Yes, it's true. Especially if you look at the original Mini, the original British Minis that now look like toys. That's true, but I notice even that your biggest grocery stores, your Tesco's, that were opening these monstrous football field sized stores, even they're going back and opening more smaller stores and moving. People are, I believe, I could be wrong, and you could correct me, that there is a tendency in North America, in Toronto, where I live, that people are coming back downtown. They realize that this is where you want to live, that it's nice to be able to walk out to the pub instead of having to get in your car to drive everywhere like you do in the suburbs. This is a trend that's happening everywhere, and I think is really important. So, and I think that will begin to negate the bigger cars that you're seeing on the road. Certainly with the cost of fuel and the congestion charge that you have in London, I'm surprised to hear you say that that's actually happening.
Well, let's move it on a little bit. I mean, there are elements, there are obviously good things that we have in the UK, but I always think that people can go further, can't they? They can
Yes.
try harder, they can do more, and I see myself as that person too. And one of the funny things, when I started research on the house that I would like to build, something that's much more energy efficient, I perhaps didn't realise how good my situation was at the moment, that I live in a quite compact terraced house that's right in the middle of the town. So all of these things that we've just been discussing.
Right. You've
But
got shared walls so that your only exposure is on three sides instead of five. And as you say, it's compact.
so it's all good. But I just wondered, for the people that are, like me, hoping to create a house, actually going down that route and building something that's low impact, what advice would you give them?
Well, the first thing that I would say that everyone should be looking at, that's the real way of the future, is the passive house. And the passive house movement, I know, is really gaining traction in Britain. And it's, I think, so incredibly logical that you just pile on the insulation to a degree that you really don't need much to heat it or cool it at all. And it's counterbalancing the other trend that people are talking about is the net zero house. And I frankly don't think much of net zero because basically, you can make your tent net zero if you're willing to throw enough money at solar panels on the roof. It doesn't necessarily lead to a house that consumes less energy. It just leads to a house that you're using solar energy, but it never takes into account the energy needed to make those solar panels, the area of the roof, what happens if someone else is planting trees and shading your panels. So I'm most enthusiastic about the passive house. I'm also seeing a lot of use of different, more innovative materials. I've even seen recently a straw bale passive house, which I think is an incredible concept. So that's where I would go.
What? You don't need to persuade me. I think it's a really good idea. What about the other end of the spectrum then? If we're looking at buildings that claim to be green and perhaps they're not, do you see mistakes that keep on recurring, or is it actually down this net zero route?
Well, I see lots of mistakes that keep recurring. I see that there's still far, far too much glazing, far too big windows. New house means giant picture window. When I was in school, my professor would teach us that, a window is supposed to frame a view. It's not just to be a wall of glass. And the fact of the matter is, even the best windows you get still have R values that are negligible compared to walls. So in terms of design, I think that that's a really important feature. The other thing is that so many house plans are in fact incredibly inefficient, that the houses just end up much bigger than they have to be because there's so much space lost to corridor or duplication of spaces that aren't even needed, or oversized rooms, misproportioned rooms. And this is where I think that there's a failure among people to actually hire professionals, to use architects who actually can lay things out properly. Everyone says, oh, I saw this house plan, I can adapt that, I can do this, push this here, push that there. But I think that sometimes it does take a professional. And yet I believe the percentage of houses that are actually designed by architects is 3%. So I think that the profession's at fault there because they charge a lot of money. But I think there has to be more professional design. There are now in the States, I don't know if in the UK, there are companies that have sprouted up to actually sell plans from architects, which mean that there is a resolved plan that you get for a much better price. I'd like to see more of that as well.
I'm certainly aware of that service, but I wouldn't be able to tell you anything about the market here in the UK, and it's probably global plans from the internet is the way things go. Thinking for a moment about home buyers and the people who want to invest in quality, how can they tell that a house is energy efficient? Is that another reason why you like passive house?
Yes, if it's a passive house, it's got to have been tested with a blower test, and it's looked at with thermal cameras to find the leaks. And unless it meets the air exchange, the air tightness regulation, it doesn't get the label. And so many of the greenhouses, so-called green buildings, aren't actually tested. It was one of the problems with the big LEED program in North America, that everybody would say, oh, I've designed this building to be green, but then they never actually test it to see if things are installed properly, if they actually work. and if they're actually maintained, because so many of these complex systems people just get tired of and they just turn them off. So you've got to keep it simple and you've got to have it verified, which Passive House does, and then you can be sure. There's so much greenwash going on that you've got to at least have some verifiable system.
Just before we started this interview, you mentioned that you'd actually been influenced a lot by the past and you have a love of historic buildings. So I'm very intrigued how all of that will fit into what we've been talking about so far.
Well, one thing, for instance, that's happening all over is that some of the most successful people in the building trades are the replacement window salesmen who come in and say, I can cut your energy costs in half by tearing out your single glazed windows and putting in these vinyl double glazed windows. Well, it isn't true. The increase in energy efficiency by replacing those windows is almost negligible. The cost of it is really high. And the old windows are really part of the character of these houses. And they could be 200 years old now and last another 200 years. So, whereas vinyl replacement windows, the joke is they're called replacement windows because every 15 years you've got to replace them. Double glazed glass doesn't hold that argon inside of it for more than 10 years. Then it's just got air blowing through them. So, I think the important thing is, particularly if one is buying an older house, is to fix what you've got, to caulk and seal and caulk some more, put on storm windows, either internal or external, but don't fall for these window salesmen. It's the last thing one should do in a renovation, really, in terms of cost, in terms of bang for your buck. It's a real waste of money. Insulation and sealing are the two most important things. But people don't want to insulate it because your neighbors don't see it. You know, if you buy solar panels or you buy new windows, then your neighbors can see the investment. If you just add insulation in your attic or in your walls, who knows that? And that's a real problem.
And I know that you've been on a trip to China recently. I
Yes.
certainly found the blog posts very interesting, quite daunting though as well, because we're all in this together. So how do you see tackling energy efficiency as a world?
That is truly one of the most troubling questions you could possibly ask. Because I was in China and I saw the 5 million cars in Beijing, and I saw in the more provincial capital that I was in Hunan, apartment buildings 60 stories high going up everywhere, roads being built out into the country. The energy consumption there is per capita is going up like mad. The last 2 days I had in Beijing, I could barely see and I could barely breathe. The pollution was so bad. And you see that and you just think, well, what's the point? What difference does what I do make? And the fact of the matter is probably in the long run, not much at all. But we don't have a choice. China is going to have its eyes opened at some point very soon that it can't keep on doing what it's doing. And for the rest of us, I think that all we can do is what we can to make it better. The week before I went to China, I went to Copenhagen, and there was a city that's gone from maybe 10% of the people riding bicycles 30 years ago to 50% of it. They just decided we're going to change the way we live. We're going to build bicycle lanes. We're going to promote bicycles. We're going to make cars almost socially unacceptable for getting around. We're going to eliminate parking. And suddenly the whole place is just wonderful. And you go there and you get in your bike and you can drive everywhere and you just feel part of a whole scene. And that eventually is going to spread.
I think you're right. And it's almost as if they're doing it quietly. A number of countries, they're perhaps getting on with energy efficiency, creating these lifestyles around bicycles. And I'm convinced that they may become the world leaders. People who are moving in this direction will naturally be the people that we'll look to when we get in trouble.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're doing amazing things there. And it's not a big country and it's a wealthy country. And when I compare it to going almost straight from there to China, it's a completely different world. But China, I think is figuring it out. I was visiting one company that's building some of the greenest, most efficient buildings that I've ever seen, and they're all prefabricated and they're got fabulous air quality and really terrific insulation. And if this company actually takes off, it will change the way these buildings are built.
You mentioned that you like factory building and prefab. How is it advancing? Is this something that's being embraced more on a world scale?
Depends where you look. In Scandinavia, almost every house is built that way now. After the oil crisis in the 70s, got 40 years ago, they started investing very seriously in improving their building technologies and really concluded that the only way you can really get all the joints right and everything together properly at the tolerances you need is to go prefabricated. So they're very, very good at it. In North America, less so, because anybody with a pickup truck and a nail gun can call themselves a builder, and it makes it very, very difficult for the factories to actually compete. And nobody in America cares about quality as much as they do about cost per square foot is the only thing that appears to matter there. And the bigger a house, the lower the cost per square foot, because it's just air. The kitchens and the bathrooms, which are the expensive things, are paid for. In Britain, where land, I think, is in much more limited quantity and lots are smaller, I don't think it's gone to the degree that it has in the United States. I do know that there are some interesting things being done in Britain in prefabrication. Lord Foster, the architect, did an amazing housing community. I can't remember the name of it right now. That's all prefabrication, and it's got tremendous energy efficiency out of it. So I do think that ultimately it is the way that more and more stuff is going to be built. The old line I used to do when I was selling prefab is you don't build your car in the driveway. Why do you build your house in it, you know?
I think we're definitely going to come round, and particularly, it's just that precision, isn't it? You can't get that using traditional ways of building.
No, you really can't. And you also get some economies of scale. I mean, when I used to practice as an architect, and you'd see someone building a summer cottage, which most people, you have more of a self-build culture in Britain where people do go out and build their own houses. In North America, it's almost impossible to get land. It's all in the control of the developers who want to sell you the house and the land. So the only time that people do build their own houses is really their second home country properties. And you'd see a little house being built and there'd be 15 pickup trucks around it, all of which guys are driving 50 miles to get to the job site. And the waste, you know, they run out of nails. They've got to drive half an hour to the hardware store. It's ridiculous. Whereas with prefabrication, the whole thing just comes and slides off the truck and you don't worry about that. So there are, I think, huge advantages for self-build in using prefabrication.
I'll just say one thing about self-build in the UK, because we're not actually as advanced as you might think we are. The rest of Europe are very good, but we are still, well, it sounds like we're in a very similar situation to you in regards of our volume house builders have a chokehold over all of the land. And we're pushing for more self-build, but it's easier said than done. Let's wrap up here anyway. Do you have some closing thoughts, perhaps, on how we're doing with green design?
The problem is, I think that there's actually declining interest in sustainable design and sustainable building over the last few years. I'm seeing it in the numbers of TreeHugger. I'm seeing it in all around that since the Great Recession started, since the economic troubles started, people are far more concerned about the cost of things than they are actually about the quality and the energy efficiency of things. So a lot of those resources that you would go to, they're thinner than they used to be. Even TreeHugger is sort of less about design than it used to be. And we have a lot more cute, fuzzy animal stories because there hasn't been as much change recently, as much new development, as many new technologies as there used to be. And people are preoccupied with money. And people, I think, also there's a major point about people sometimes are preoccupied with the wrong things. Like in the States, it's probably more so again than in Britain because you have much more hot water hydronic heating than forced air, I believe, where everybody's obsessed with setback, computerized setback thermostats that connect to the internet and all of these displays of your energy consumption and that. Well, it's all just meaningless. It's what you want is you want to just have a generally lower temperature. You don't need to have it going up and down like a yo-yo. You don't need all of these computerized things. What you need is to know how to use what you have to get a mix of humidity, ventilation, and temperature, how to dress appropriately for the climate, and less of the high technology stuff. So that's the problem in saying what's to look at. I really promote simple, logical approaches that frankly aren't that different from what your grandparents did in the previous ages of austerity. Turn down the thermostat, put on a sweater, live in a smaller space.
Well, that sounds a really good place to leave it. Lloyd, can I thank you very much for coming onto the podcast?
Absolutely, yes. It was a pleasure.
You can find out more about Lloyd in our show notes. For this episode, it's houseplanninghelp.com/35. And I took away from that chat that there is an overall shift in our outlook. We know what we've got to do. Perhaps it's taking time to filter through, but I think overall it's a positive message. We've just got to keep it going and not get too distracted by the big picture, as I've tried to do in today's episode. But I did like what Lloyd said at the end as well about how we can each do our bit, can't we? That's really what's going to make this work. We are all important. I have a question for you waiting in the show notes. How have you noticed people's attitudes changing where you live? Or you can comment on any other aspect of the podcast. We put some links across to TreeHugger.com, some of those pictures that Lloyd took on his trip over there to China, which I think are very interesting to look at, and a few other bits and pieces. I wanted to thank you for your encouragement on iTunes because this means a lot to me. I try to produce content that's useful and hopefully I'm hitting the mark for some of you. Simron in the Netherlands says, wonderful podcast. That's the title of this one. This show has really helped me a lot on gaining information on sustainable homes. Lots of useful information. Paul Podvalej from Canada. This is a very informative podcast covering all issues related to building a passive house. I highly recommend this podcast for anyone interested in learning how to achieve high levels of energy efficiency, building new or retrofitting. Thanks, Ben. No, thank you, Paul. SpinnyX says a must-have in your toolbox. They are a really well-produced set of podcasts if you're interested in building, with a great range of content. Whether you're renovating, building new, or just researching the future of housing, these are essential listening. And we'll do one more. This is from the UK iTunes store. Sad Truth says professional and informative. Ben has a great range of guests and asks the questions that really need answering, providing just enough information on the subject without getting overly technical. Great podcast. That's what I'm trying to do. That's a really nice comment for me. I appreciate that, Sad Truth. A call to action as well. Well, as we've been talking about iTunes, if that's how you're listening to us, maybe you could add a review there because this continues to help newcomers find our content. Next time, my guest is Kath Hassel from ECH2O Consultants. We're looking at water and particularly how you can save water when you're creating your new home or retrofitting. What do we need to think about? So those are some of the issues that we'll bring up next time. Thanks for listening.